Hello and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar series hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of the adaptation community between the biennial National Adaptation Forum events. Visit the National Adaptation Forum website to learn about our past forums, including our most recent gathering in April of 2019. We are currently planning for the 5th National Adaptation Forum, which will take place in spring of 2022 in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Molly Johnson. I'm one of the National Adaptation Forum organizers, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, where we will be revisiting Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, a Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu for Indigenous-led climate adaptation. So before we get started, I want to go over some housekeeping that will ensure we have a successful webinar. So please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute for now. This will help us to reduce feedback. If you're using microphone voice over IP option, please ensure that you place your computer on mute, even if you are listed in as muted when you log in. And we will have time after the presentation for actually a live Q&A session. So throughout the webinar, you can submit any questions you have to the presenters, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end. Please also use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering along the way, and we will do our best to help you solve those. We will be recording this webinar rewind and posting it on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, so for future viewing. So you can find that in about a week at www.cakex.org. Finally, much of this webinar is going to consist of replaying the original recording of this webinar from 2019. Sound for this video will only be available through your computer speakers. So keep in mind that if you called in via the phone, you will not be able to hear this portion unless you also turn on your computer speakers. Once again, if you do have any trouble, reach out to us via the chat box, and we will do our best to resolve any issues you may have. So joining us live today are two presenters from the original webinar. Rob Croll is a policy analyst and climate change program coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, where he focuses on integrating Indigenous, traditional, ecological, and experiential knowledge with scientific research in natural resources, climate adaptation for the benefit of its 11 Anishinaabe member tribes, for GLFWC's 11 member tribes. And then we have Stephen Handler with us live as well. He is a climate change specialist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. There he coordinates the Northwoods Climate Change Response Framework, which involves building partnerships, assessing climate change risk, and working with land managers and landowners to develop real-world projects to adapt and prepare for future change. So thank you to Rob and Stephen for being here today with us, and we look forward to the live Q&A session with you a little later on. We also, in this recording, will feature Sarah Smith, who is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menomonee Nation, as part of the Sustainable Development Institute, where she works to facilitate stronger relationships between tribes, climate researchers, tribal and non-tribal organizations, and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So with all of that said, I will now play the clipped version of the 2019 recording, and then we will have our live question and answer session after. You can submit questions once again via the question function throughout the presentation. And as a reminder, sound for this video will only be available through your computer speakers. So be sure to turn up your computer volume or reach out if you have any difficulties. And finally, you can also make the video larger by clicking View on your top bar of your screen and selecting View Full Screen. So with all that said, let's get started, and I'll play the recording.
Sigus Wahwegu, Sarah Smith Yungias, Onio Tiaga Ni Io Kale Wagwaho Ni Wagadoloda. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah Smith, and I'm going to start us off today on our presentation for the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. So this is just a brief outline of what we're going to try to cover today and within the hour. So we'll go over introductions and introduce the TAM team. We'll cover adaptation menus and how they work. Then we'll introduce the TAM as well as the guiding principles. We'll get into some of the strategies and approaches that are in the menu, and then we'll finish up with some of the workshops and example projects that we've been working with. So this is Tribal Adaptation Menu Team, or we like to call ourselves the TAM team. So all the names you see in the circle are all the authors of the menu, and we decided to go this route instead of having like a first author and second author listed to show that we are all equal in this process, and nobody was above one another when we were working on the menu and when we created it. At the bottom, you'll see some of the logos for the different organizations and tribes that were involved with this project, and these are just a few. We also don't have all the logos from the different tribes that helped to work on this as well, including tribes such as Lac-du-Flambeau, Menomonee, Keweenaw, Red Cliff. So this is a very diverse team. It includes tribes, intertribal organizations, federal partners, universities. So it was a really diverse mix of people. So this is just some of the menu team. This was actually in September when this was taken. So you can see some of the members here, and members that aren't listed on the author page include members such as Jo, who's the little girl in the picture. Some of our team members would bring their children to our meetings and also to our workshops, and they're really integral into this process, not only just to help give us energy after lunch, but to remind us of why we are doing this. Looking at the 7 generations, thinking about them and also their children and their grandchildren and how this will affect them. And so, yeah, this is just a small group of us. It's hard to get all of us together at once, but this is just some of us. And I'll pass it over to Rob.
Okay, bonjour everyone. I guess before I start talking about climate change and tribal nations, I want to say just briefly, the title of the menu in Ojibwe and Menomonee is Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, which means literally doing something the Anishinaabe way. But as with most indigenous languages, there are often deeper layers of meaning, and the idea behind this really is doing this the original or the first way. So when we think about climate change and tribes, it's a very broad topic that we could actually talk about for the entire hour and more. So we're just going to touch on a couple things briefly that have a bearing on why the menu was created and why it was created the way it was. So this slide shows some beach erosion on Lake Superior. Okay, well, we're on the next slide. Anyway, we're talking about tribal nations. Realize that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks. So when we're talking about climate change impacts to tribal nations, realize that there are 573 federally recognized tribes and tribal groups, 60 state recognized tribes, and countless tribes that have been disenfranchised by government policy and action. Each one of them have their own climate change story, and it's not our place to tell those stories. However, When we think about tribes that have a land base, a reservation, tribal homeland, or treaty-ceded territory, they're vulnerable to climate change in all the same ways as any other community. Things like infrastructure, roads and bridges. These slides here are from the Bad River Reservation in Odena, Wisconsin, back in 2016. Massive 1,000-year flood basically cut off the reservation for a couple weeks. Supplies were having to be flown in on helicopters, and medical patients were having to be flown out. So we realized that a lot of climate change impacts tribal communities are going to be the same as communities in other places. However, because of location and socioeconomic, often on the front lines of the climate crisis. So another thing we think about is natural resources. And natural resources which tribal people continue to rely upon for food, medicine, and cultural purposes, as they have since time immemorial. And these resources are vulnerable to climate change as well. This slide is from our Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission vulnerability assessment, and it indicates some of the most vulnerable species that we have assessed to date, such as Menomonee or wild rice, wabouge or snowshoe hare, moose, white cedar, walleye, all species which we were directed by our 11 tribes to research because they're species which they rely upon for daily life, for medicine, for ceremony. In addition, these non-human beings are also viewed as elders and relatives and teachers with whom people have had long-term reciprocal relationships from time immemorial. And this is obviously a paradigm shift from the dominant perspective of these beings being resources. Next. So briefly, we'll talk about wild rice. It was listed as the most vulnerable species in our glyphic vulnerability assessment. As you can see from the slide, it is impacted by a lot of things, not just climate change. Human land use changes, limited ability to disperse. It's an aquatic annual grain, and with heavy seeds, so it's not something that's easily carried by birds or blown in the wind. It's adapted to cold or cool environments. It requires particular hydrological regime. It's susceptible to disturbance, pathogens, particularly when conditions get warmer, dependent on ice and snow, and it lacks genetic variation. Menominee is integral to the Anishinaabe worldview. It's the subject of their migration story. People originally lived on the East Coast and followed prophecy to the place where food grows on the water. That food was wild rice. It's used in ceremony. It's used as a daily foodstuff. It's used in feasts and at powwows, and it's difficult to separate wild rice from the cultural and worldview of Ojibwe people. Next. So then we realized that culturally important beings are moving or shifting ranges or disappearing due to climate change. At the same time, tribal homelands, reservations, and treaty-ceded territories are fixed in place, and the loss of access to culturally important beings and the reciprocal relationships that have been maintained since time immemorial is an existential threat to Indigenous culture and community. And when adapting to climate change, actions must be culturally appropriate and community supported. And now we're going to Stephen.
Okay, folks, so now I kind of want to provide a little bit of context as to the overall purpose and structure of an adaptation menu, in case this is a new topic for you and you're wondering how all of these ideas actually appear in the document and how we hope to help people work with a range of adaptation concepts. Next. So the foundation for this adaptation menu framework for structuring climate adaptation concepts really comes from a document that was put together in 2012 called the Forest Adaptation Resources. This is something that my coworkers at NIAX assembled before I actually started at NIAX. And the idea was that actors in the forestry community were starting to get a handle on climate change vulnerability information, but they were asking for more resources and more guidance on how to help forests adapt to change. Now, importantly, what they did not want was recommendations and prescriptions on how exactly they were supposed to help their forests adapt. Instead, what they really wanted was something flexible, something organized with a lot of good suggestions. So that's really the guiding vision that went into this product. Next. Now, within the Forest Adaptation Resources document, the first part that you will find is a thought process. What we call the Adaptation Workbook is really a structured sequence of questions to help a land manager or a resource manager or a landowner figure out how climate change risk might affect them personally in a specific place, and to develop their own custom-built adaptation plan. So what you'll find in this adaptation workbook is not rocket science, but it's a sequence of 5 steps around these basic ideas of defining where you are and what you're trying to accomplish on the land, what are climate change risks for that particular place, and how might a particular place have higher or lower climate change vulnerability than neighboring places on the landscape. The third step is to take a hard look at your management objectives that you started with and try to come to terms with whether or not you think those objectives are still feasible given climate change risks. The fourth step then becomes brainstorming many different ways to help adapt and prepare for change. And then finally, the fifth step of this adaptation workbook asks you to come up with some ideas about how to monitor and evaluate your effectiveness as you go forward through time. So that's the overall structure of how we have helped land managers and landowners think about climate change adaptation. Next. The other half of the Forest Adaptation Resources document is actually a forest adaptation menu. And this was the first instance, the first time that NIAX tried to assemble an adaptation menu. And basically, it is kind of like what it sounds. It is a collection of plausible adaptation actions that are specific to a discipline. So the first forest adaptation menu contained mostly silviculture and forest management kinds of ideas, because that was the audience we were writing for. Just like you might walk into an Italian restaurant or a Chinese restaurant, you generally expect that menu to kind of cover a certain type of content. And so we try to write these menus in a way that really reflects the audience's needs and expectations. Next. Next again. Great. The other thing that is important to know about these adaptation menus is that their structure, I think, is vital to working with them, and I think it's also vital to making them useful. So initially, when we started working on forest adaptation and looking through the literature on the guidance and recommendations that were published on adaptation, you tend to find a huge mix of concepts and ideas really batched together sometimes in a way that is confusing. So you might find large conceptual ideas like manage for connectivity across large landscapes, right next to more tactical ideas like, providing a range of crossing opportunities for streams to accommodate different water levels. And that can be tough for a manager to deal with when, you know, ideas are kind of presented without a respect to scale or scope. So really, in these adaptation menus, we try to provide a hierarchy that is useful. And I'll go into what that hierarchy means in a few seconds. And then next slide. The last thing I'll say about these menus is that we attempt to be as thorough and comprehensive as possible. Many times these adaptation menus are based on say a search of the scientific literature or extensive interviews with professionals working in that field. So we try to go all the way from appetizers to desserts to brunch cocktails in the same menu. Even though some of those ideas might be opposing, you know, you might not show up at a restaurant looking for dessert and cocktails, but we want to give people the full range of options that they have for adaptation so that they can pick and choose what is most appropriate for their situation. Next slide. Okay, and a couple of things that have worked well with these adaptation menus. I mentioned the structure earlier, and I'll explain that quickly here. So, so we all are talking in the same language. We define adaptation in different tiers of activity. The highest tier in our way of thinking about it is that you have very few large adaptation options. You might think of 3 or maybe 4 of these, like resist change or encourage a major transition. Okay, so these are kind of the 30,000-foot, very conceptual attitudes towards climate change adaptation. So in this instance, I'm highlighting resistance as one potential option that a manager could come into a project thinking about, that this is a place to try to hold the line and play defense against change. We realize that those large and fuzzy options are actually a long way from the guidance that managers are looking for. So the adaptation menus are really structured around the next 2 tiers of thinking, strategies and approaches. And so what we try to do is, strategies are still high-level concepts. So I'm showing you an example from the Tribal Adaptation Menu here. Our strategy 4 is sustain fundamental ecological and cultural functions. That kind of gives you a flavor. It's still connected to this resistance idea from the option up above, but it is much more specific. Within each strategy in the menu, I think there are something like 12 or 13 strategies in the Tribal Adaptation Menu. Underneath each strategy, you might find 5 or 10 more specific approaches. So within that strategy 4, we have approach 4.5, revitalize and maintain Anishinaabe and cultural use of Ishkode or fire as a stewardship tool. Okay, so a much more distinct idea on how you would actually pursue strategy 4. And then this is meant to be a jumping off point for managers. Okay, we stop at approaches, and the idea is that an individual manager takes that idea and carries it forward to flesh out the how, when, where, why, to make it a tactic that you could implement for adaptation. Next slide. Yeah, so in this case, thinking about traditional use of fire, applying prescribed burns to marsh habitats is an idea that has come up in some of our workshops. The other advantage of these adaptation menus and their structure is that they help to clarify the intent of why you might pursue a particular action. So because the more discrete ideas, the approaches and tactics are connected to the larger ideas, the options and strategies, it helps communicate why you're doing the small things or the distinct things. And if you already come in with a tactic in mind, you can work the other way up the menu and figure out, well, how does this tactical level idea I have relate to some of the larger concepts on adaptation? So it's kind of a two-way street to help communicate the intent of adaptation. Also, we found that it's really helpful to have one collection of adaptation ideas, especially when you're working in groups between multiple agencies, between different backgrounds and perspectives. It helps people to have a consistent framework and a consistent language on adaptation. So you can express ideas and say, oh no, I'm thinking of this on the menu. This is what I'm trying to say. I see that your idea is related to this. Here's how they can be blended. Yeah, so it's just nice to have a common point of reference. And then finally, these menus are mostly about boosting creativity. So like I mentioned, we try to have a very wide collection of adaptation ideas, and we hope that we're presenting people with things that they have not considered before and that might be a little outside their comfort zones. So these can be challenging, and they're meant to kind of stimulate creativity in new and interesting ways. Great. I'll hand it off now.
So thinking about all of that, I'm going to talk about how the Tribal Adaptation Menu began. The inception of the Tribal Adaptation Menu started back in the spring of 2017 when some of our TAM team members attended one of the workshops put on by NIAX using their Forested Watersheds menu. So two of our members are in this picture here, Melanie Montana, who's in the very top middle, and then Tansy Moore, who's on the right. And so they were working on a project at this workshop focused on wild rice restoration. And while they were there, they realized that although this menu was really great, it was missing something, and it was this need for Indigenous perspectives. So these adaptation menus primarily have been very reflective of more of this Western science, resource-centric perspective, and the need was to create a menu that was reflective of Indigenous knowledge and more this kin-centric perspective. So instead of viewing species as just resources, viewing them as our relatives, like it is in Indigenous knowledge and ways of thinking about it. So the new menu is based on an Indigenous way of decision making and conduct, and engaging in those Indigenous sciences and knowledge. And there's a trend now for Eurocentric science to look at Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous science to help with their management, which has been, foundations for tribes for millennia and how we go about doing what we do on the land. Next slide. And so this Tribal Adaptation Menu is primarily developed for the use in Indigenous communities, mainly for natural resource professionals, but also with non-Indigenous partners as well. So that can include people like Forest Service, CNR, universities. And so this menu is to help bridge communication barriers for those non-tribal people and organizations who are interested in Indigenous approaches and understanding values and needs of tribal communities. And so the menu itself can be used across numerous ecosystems and scales, management goals and values. Next slide. And so this menu, the Tribal Adaptation Menu, is kind of just our first edition or first version. It's based primarily on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, language, culture, and values, which are all integrated into the menu. And it's intentionally designed to be adaptable for other Indigenous communities, for them to incorporate their language, their knowledge, their culture, and their values. So this is just kind of an example of how other tribes can use it. Next slide. And so something that's different from the other adaptation menus are these guiding principles. And I think Molly was going to include a link in the chat box if people wanted to pull it up while I'm going through this. But this is something we have at the beginning of our document, and it provides a framework to integrate Indigenous and traditional knowledge, language, culture into the adaptation planning process. And it talks about things like community engagement, sort of this decolonizing scientific research and methodologies and application in Indigenous communities, and in those co-management areas like ceded territories. And just like the menu itself, these guiding principles can be adapted by the different tribes based on their values. So although this menu is based primarily on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, those tribes themselves may have different values and culture and language that they want to include in the menu. And that way, tribes can fit it for their value and their language. Next slide. And so in the guiding principles, it talks about things like the importance of human and non-human relationships. So recognizing that the natural world is full of our teachers and our elders. Based on our teachings and stories, humans were put last on Earth. And so everything else are our teachers. So that includes the plants, the animals, the waters. So recognizing that importance. It includes cultural paradigms, and this especially can be adapted tribe to tribe on what they would like to highlight. Community engagement and decision making is mentioned in there. And then also how to go about ending a project and disseminating information. And really keeping in mind when working with tribes, who owns that information, what knowledge and information can be shared, and which knowledges shouldn't be shared to certain people. So really thinking about that. Next slide. And so Indigenous perspectives call for observation and recognizing and learning from our first teachers. So like I mentioned, our elders, so our plants and our animals, and adaptation going about with responsibility and reciprocity to all of our relations. And it's a different perspective than the Western management, where it in Western science it tends to emphasize control and management of these resources, so these non-sentient beings. And so this menu itself is a different perspective on that. Next slide. So our menu really touches on respect, reciprocity, and relationships. So thinking about the use of our relatives, our decision making was mainly communal and based on consensus, whereas today's management and decision making is mainly made from an individual or institutionalized way of going about it. And this menu, for example, was based on consensus. And so if there was something in the menu when we were going through it that didn't fit well with somebody, we would take the time to talk about it and go over it more in detail. And I'll talk about an example of that a little bit later in the slides. But everything we put in the menu was based on the consensus of our group. Next slide. So I'm going to talk real briefly about a few strategies and approaches that I pulled from the menu, just to kind of give you an example of what that looks like. So next slide. So thinking about how it differs from the fourth adaptation menu, we pulled these two strategies just as an example on how they differ. And so in the fourth adaptation menu, there's strategy 9, which is facilitate community adjustments through species transition. And an approach under that would be to introduce species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And so something that's really similar in the Tribal Adaptation Menu, but also slightly different, is Strategy 11, which is encourage community adjustments and transition while maintaining reciprocity and balance. And so an example approach of that would be to seek out and share traditional and cultural knowledge of potential new beings from tribal communities where those beings are currently native. And this could go vice versa as well, sharing information with those tribal communities or even First Nations that are north of us. When thinking about species transitioning and recognizing that we need to be communicating with both those south of us and north of us, even if there's those political borders of the US and Canada, being able to share that knowledge with each other. And so, next slide. This is just a brief outline of the different strategies that are in the menu. So there are 14 overall, and I'll go through a few of them real quickly with you today. So next slide. The first three that I want to touch on are strategies 1 through 3, and these we thought were really important to have in the very beginning of the menu. So strategy 1 talks about considering cultural practices and seeking spiritual guidance. So this could be consulting with knowledge holders, community members, elders, making sure our practices are mindful and based on reciprocity and respect. And then strategy 2 is a little bit different from sort of the Western perspective of learning from beings and natural communities as they respond to changing conditions over time. So this thought of kind of doing nothing is doing something. And so that's actually one of the last strategies we came up with to put in there, which is really different from strategies that talk about maybe managing after a disturbance and revegetating right away. So kind of like how Stephen said, there are contradicting strategies and approaches in the menu, but it's meant to be like that. And then strategy 3 really hits on tribal engagement. And so this could be things of like language revitalization programs, youth programs, environmental education, communicating opportunities for use of tribal and public lands. So these are the first 3 strategies that we have in there. And then, like Stephen mentioned, under each approach, we have a few example tactics as well. So next slide. And the other strategy I wanted to touch on real briefly is strategy 5, mainly looking at strategy or approach 5.2. So like I said, we came to everything in this menu based on consensus. And so 5.2 is maintain and improve the ability of communities to balance the effects of non-local beings, or in sort of the Western perspective would be invasive species. So this is something we talked about for pretty much an entire day, because we didn't, as a group, like the term invasive species, because it is so derogatory towards them and very negative. And so these invasive species, they're just going about what they were told based on their original instructions. They're just in a different place. And it really isn't their fault that they don't have the same checks and balances as they do from where they came from. So really changing that perception of invasive species, instead of, going to war with them, but thinking about, well, maybe they can contribute to the community, or maybe there's a use for them that we just haven't realized yet. So next slide. So those are just examples on the approaches and strategies that are in the menu. And like I said, there are 14 strategies overall. So you can take a look at them yourself, see what all is in there. But I'll turn it back over to Rob.
Okay, so the first question that we get asked most of the time when we go out to do presentations or talk to people about the menu is, where can I go to see a write-up of a project that was actually done using the menu? And unfortunately, we're not at that point yet. Next slide. So since January of 2019, we've done 4 workshops using the menu, using the Adaptation Workbook and menu process. These are 2.5-day workshops where participants come, they bring projects from their community or from their agency, and they work in teams to go through the workbook and menu process. And these typically are natural resource projects, but they aren't all natural resource projects. And the menu has actually accommodated things like infrastructure projects, emergency planning. So next slide. First workshop we did was in Cloquet, Minnesota. It was back in January before the menu was even released. We had a number of different tribal agencies there, most from Minnesota, some from Wisconsin, one from Oklahoma, and one from one of the Lakota communities. Some of the projects that we saw there, tribal wetland restoration from the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma. Some of our Glyphwick folks were working on paper birch habitat and restoration. And folks from Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, were working on forest management using cultural fire to enhance moose habitat. The Tribal Wetland Restoration Project is actually in process now and will be written up and will be available on the NIAC's website at forestadaptation.org, which we may get to mention a little bit later in the presentation. Next. Our second workshop was in Bay Mills, Michigan. The photograph there is actually a poster. Part of the workshop process is creating posters that reflect the entire workshop process, the entire workbook process, and how the menu was used. So some of our projects there, Great Lakes Coastal Marsh and Menomonee Restoration with the Sioux Tribe of Chippewa Indians, Cedar Restoration with Bay Mills, USDA Forest Service folks were there and were working on road and stream crossings on the Hiawatha National Forest. And Bay Mills Community College had a team that came and were working on leak restoration in and around the Bay Mills community. And I believe several of those projects are also in process. Next. A third workshop was at the College of Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. Tribes there included the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, the Ho-Chunk Nation, Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, and projects including sea level rise preparation, creating an indigenous focused Wisconsin Master Naturalist class, and cranberry restoration. Another project from that workshop is actually going to be creating interpretive materials for a vulnerability assessment done by the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in Wisconsin. That project is in process as well, and when it's complete, will be written up. Next. And the fourth workshop that we did was actually in Mohawk territory in Akwesasne on the New York-Canada border. This was the first workshop that used 2 menus, the Forest Adaptation Menu and the TAM, and was also the first workshop that was done outside of the greater Midwest area, where we had tribes bringing in their language and their culture and using it with the Tribal Adaptation Menu, and it was a very good fit. Some of those projects included preparation for the emerald ash borer and black ash, culturally appropriate invasive species control or non-local being control, and critical infrastructure planning. So the menu's been validated on not just natural resource projects, and we do have projects that are in process that will be available as case studies in the future. Next slide.
Okay, this is Stephen again, and I guess the last thing we wanted to leave you all with today, kind of like Rob mentioned, Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad is ready to kind of move beyond the territory where we have designed it and tested it. So we mentioned that this was built mostly with Menomonee and Ojibwe traditions, languages, and perspectives in mind. We have started testing it with other tribes and communities from around the country, and we know that it should be tailored and customized for use in more broadly diverse communities. So we're wondering, how best can we facilitate that? How can we help tribes and Native communities from around the country take the tool and customize it for their own use? And then related to that, we have always imagined the Tribal Adaptation Menu being a communications tool between tribal and non-tribal organizations and people. And so if you have ideas on that about how to use this kind of product as a communication and collaboration tool, we would also love to hear that.
Thank you all for watching that. And I want to say a special thanks to Rob and Stephen for being with us today to start off a question and answer session. So keep in mind that you can still submit any questions you might have after watching the webinar from 2019 to us, and we will do our best to get to all of them today. And I also wanted to point out that the actual menu itself is available for download in the handout section on your control panel. So make sure to download that today. So I want to start off, I'll start off asking Rob, do you have any updates since you presented on this webinar?
Sure, Molly. Bonjour, everybody. So since we presented last, we did one additional workshop. It was hosted by the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. It was held in Ashland, Wisconsin. And we squeaked it in right before the pandemic brought everything to a screeching halt. So we obviously can't do any in-person workshops or anything like that right now, and won't be able to for the foreseeable future. Some good news though, from the Cloquet workshop, the tribal wetland project done by the Iowa Nation down in Oklahoma is complete. I believe there's a write-up about it on Forest Adaptation, the NIAX website, and which Stephen can probably talk a little bit more about. And the LEAK project from the Bay Mills workshop got funded through the Distinct Tribal Program under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So those are a couple pretty cool developments. And since we're kind of on hiatus, we're working on a train the trainer project to help us build our facilitator base for workshops, and some really preliminary discussions about how we move the workshop process maybe to a more virtual format.
That sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, Stephen, do you have anything you want to add about the Tribal Wetland Restoration Project?
I am posting a link to that project right now, and maybe one of you can share that with the group.
Okay, great. Something that came up during watching this over is, I know Sarah mentioned that one of the great uses for this tool, for this menu, is that it can actually serve as a bridge for non-Indigenous partners to better understand Indigenous approaches. Have you seen, obviously things got sidetracked in spreading this out, but have you seen, since you launched the menu, situations or examples of that happening?
Actually, at our Red Cliff workshop, we had all of the leadership from Apostle Islands National Lakeshore participate, along with their counterparts from Red Cliff and Bad River, so that they can start integrating each other's management plans into the park's natural resource management plan. So, I mean, that's just a really super positive development there.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add a couple others. So we had at one of the workshops in Bay Mills, Michigan, we had a couple of representatives from the Hiawatha National Forest who brought a watershed restoration project on, that was on Forest Service land, but it was adjacent to the Bay Mills Indian community. And that was a great opportunity for them to just be able to speak informally with their counterparts and with other folks from the region. Hey, this is the project we have in mind. How does this, how does this potentially impact tribal community members? Are there things we might consider doing differently now? And it was great to see that sort of person-to-person interaction rather than the agency to agency or nation to nation interaction, which can sometimes, you got to filter through several steps of communication, and it can often be a little stuffy that way. Also, we've also started introducing the Tribal Adaptation Menu to Forest Service project planning teams, as they're internally planning their own projects. When I work with them now, I make that resource available to them to push them to consider a little more than they might have otherwise, the cultural implications of their projects.
Fantastic. I guess some key question I have is, what's some advice, say you were to be giving a workshop on this, for anyone who's just starting to or going to try to use this menu in their community? What's your initial advice to give to them for starting out?
I think my first piece of advice would be read it all the way through. Don't pick and choose. Because especially the guiding principles section contains a lot of really good information about interacting with tribal leadership, tribal elders, and if that's something that say a non-tribal entity is looking at this menu as a tool, that's something that's going to really help them. Steven?
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that, and that would be to relax your timeline, I guess. So if you're going to do some of this work in a deliberate and intentional and respectful way, that's going to take time, but it's going to be time well spent. So, assuming that you're going to be able to do a workshop, have an idea, and just go hit the ground running, pump the brakes a little bit and be ready to do a little more work.
Yeah, definitely. That's a term that when I heard Sarah mention it on today, consensus-based decision making, I think is really important. It does take more time, but you get better results from it. I think I'll wrap up with one more question, and then obviously if either of you have anything you want to add. You know, there's different factors now with COVID-19 playing into it. As you continue this project, where do you see, I guess personally, organizationally, the long-term goals of this project headed? And I guess how would you like it to continue on?
I think from our perspective at Glyphwick, you know, we would really very much like to get back to doing in-person workshops when we can. We've been talking with some folks in the western part of the US, up in Alaska, in Canada, all of whom are interested in workshops. So we'd really like to see that continue. And I think really long-term goal is to start seeing more and more federal and state agencies take an interest, start considering tribal perspectives in the planning that they do that's going to impact Indigenous people in their state or in the country. And really use this as a jumping off point to start recognizing that Indigenous people, tribal people are still here. They have a very strong interest in climate adaptation, and that they need to be at the table, part of the conversation from day one.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have anything to add?
Just going back to the last slide in our presentation where we had the baby duckling jumping out of the nest. I think we are still looking for opportunities to work with tribal communities from other parts of the country to figure out how do these ideas and concepts that we put in the first version, how do those relate to other places, other languages, other cultures? And so if there's a way we can begin to help other tribes or communities, you take this first draft and tailor it to your own place and your own needs, that would be really exciting to me.
Thank you. And thanks again for being here and letting us also replay your presentation, which I know is, you know, it's funny to hear yourself about a year ahead of time or past. So yeah, so everyone that's here with us still, thank you for joining us today. And I want to just make sure you know that the recording from this presentation will be posted on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, and I will send out a link to you next week. And also, in addition, there's hundreds of other adaptation resources on CAKE, including resources related to today's session. We have another Summer Rewind webinar happening next week on July 29th, and it's a match made in heaven, integrating climate change into hazard mitigation planning. And that will feature a live question and answer session with Kristen Baja from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And also, I wanted to make sure you're aware that we have a call for proposals out for an upcoming webinar series relating to drought, fire, and extreme heat. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can email us at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. And finally, if you have any other recommendations for webinars we should do, you can also indicate so on your post-webinar survey. So once again, on behalf of EcoAdapt, thank you for tuning in, and we hope you stay well and you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks everybody.